Hi, we're going to continue discussing genetics. In our last video, we talked about the basics. In this video, we will look at behavioral genetics, molecular genetics, and epigenetics. And in the next video, we will look at evolutionary psychology. So, behavioral genetics is all about the nature versus nurture debate, genes versus environment. And when I say genes, I mean just genes. Sometimes students will talk about biology versus environment. But biology is too vague. That can mean all kinds of things. Here we mean just genes, and then nurture is everything else. So parents, schools, neighborhoods, what your mother ate when she was pregnant with you, the pesticides that you're exposed to on a daily basis, and so forth. So the question in behavioral genetics is, how do we explain our individual differences? So what makes me different from you? What makes you different from your siblings? Do we inherit these similarities and differences from our parents, or do we develop them through experience? And what research tells us time and time again is that for almost anything of interest to psychologists, those traits are going to be a complicated interaction between genes and environment. Behavioral genetics is interested in topics such as these. So for example, what are the influences of nature and nurture on intelligence, on personality traits, on psychological disorders? So for example, if you have a very extroverted personality, did you get that genetically from your parents, or did you develop that through experience? And behavioral genetics researchers have different methods for teasing those influences apart. In adoption studies, you measure the trait of interest in a group of children who have been adopted. And then you measure that same trait in their biological parents and then in their adoptive parents. So their biological parents share their genes but not their environment. Their adoptive parents share their environment but not their genes. So let's use extroversion as our example again. So you measure extroversion in the children and then in both sets of parents. And then if you find that on average, those children are more similar to their biological parents, who share their genes but not their environment, compared to their adoptive parents, then that's suggesting the importance of a strong genetic influence. If instead they're more similar to their adoptive parents than they are to the biological parents, then that's suggesting the importance of a strong environmental influence. And to be clear, there are numbers behind this. There's a heritability coefficient that gets calculated. So this isn't just sort of a vague discussion. There's actually numbers. Okay? A similar method is the twin study. And in a twin study, you measure the trait of interest in a group of monozygotic twins. These are identical twins, genetic clones, who share 100% of their genes. And you compare them on that trait to a group of dizygotic twins. These are just fraternal twins. They're no more or less alike than any other siblings genetically. Okay? So again, using extroversion as an example, you measure that in the identical twins, you measure it in the fraternal twins, and if you find that on that particular trait, the identical twins are more similar than the fraternal twins, that is suggesting the importance of a strong genetic influence. All right. Now you can take the twin study one step further and look only at identical twins. So you're holding genetics constant. And what varies is the environment. So you can compare identical twins reared together in the same environment versus identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in separate environments. And I'm going to show you a quick video clip that shows an example of two sets of identical twins who were accidentally swapped at birth and then reared in different environments.
Two sets of identical twins share one incredible and perhaps unprecedented story. You have one brother from each set wound up going home with the wrong family. This happened when they were newborns. They all stayed in the same hospital in Bogota, Colombia. But stay with me. Carlos here went home with Jorge, and in turn that meant their twins, William and Wilbur, then grew up together. So they thought they were fraternal and not identical. So this is a case of double case of switched at birth. A friend recorded the moment when one pair of identical twins met one another for the very first time.
Will está más blanquito.
Sí, William está más blanco.
El frío. El frío. No, pero increíble este, por Dios.
Bastante increíble. Ay, Dios mío, no, esto no puede ser cierto.
No, marica.
No, yo no puedo creer. O sea, yo analizo lo que pasó y yo digo, bueno, no sé si es mejor lo que sucedió o no ir en la calle y verlo.
How wild is this? The brother story makes for a fascinating case of nature versus nurture, is featured in this current issue of the New York Times Magazine. So with me.
Okay, so pretty wild, right? You have these two sets of identical twins born on the same day at the same hospital, and then they were accidentally swapped at birth. And so two of those twins were raised in the city, in an urban, cosmopolitan environment. The other set of twins were raised in a rural environment that didn't even have running water. Like really, really vastly different experiences. And then as adults, just by accident, they came across each other. Somebody ran into one of the twins who was working at a butcher shop, and she thought it was her friend. And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And then she showed him a picture on her phone, and she's like, "No, look, you look just like my friend." And through that, they got together and then made this crazy discovery. Okay. Now, this provides an opportunity for researchers to study nature versus nurture. The researchers did not do the separating. Okay. This was an accident that happened a long time ago. But the researchers can learn from this sort of experience and have done so in other cases as well. There have been unethical cases, but generally this is a very ethical area of research. And if you're interested, you can look into the Minnesota Twin Study from the University of Minnesota, and there's a long history of this research. Okay, so behavioral genetics research is focused on comparing people who share different proportions of genes. But they don't collect DNA. They're just going based on the proportion of genes shared. Molecular genetics piggybacks on these methods. So it builds on the traditional twin and adoption research methods, but it also collects DNA samples. And the focus in terms of molecular genetics used in psychology research is that it's identifying the connection between particular genes and psychological and behavioral functions. Okay, so traditional behavioral genetics research doesn't actually take blood samples or saliva samples or anything like that. It's just comparing twins. But molecular genetics goes a step further and actually does collect those samples and extracts the DNA and looks for the genes that are involved in specific traits. Epigenetics is a whole other branch of psychology that's building on this nature-nurture issue, but instead of looking at the genes themselves, epigenetics is looking at the chemical switches that turn genes on and off without changing the DNA code. So it was previously believed that when a baby is conceived, the slate is wiped clean genetically. They inherit just the genes, and all of their parents' experiences are not inherited. But now we know that's actually not true. So epigenetics refers to the set of switches that turn genes on and off. For example, every cell in your body has a full genome that can build you. So your heart cells include the genes that can build skin cells. It's just that those skin genes are turned off in your heart. But in your skin, the skin genes are turned on and the heart genes are turned off. Okay, so there's these little switches that influence gene expression, and those switches are influenced by the environment. And researchers have discovered all kinds of experiences: diet, stress, smoking, medication, pollution, and so on. And what I'm going to show you here is a little clip from a slightly longer clip that I'd encourage you to watch. But I'm going to show you the human part of this. The mouse part you can watch later if you're interested in. But it's going to show you epigenetics in the study of cancer.
And that brings us to the reason why we're showing you twins. In 2005, they participated in a groundbreaking study in Madrid. Its aim? To show just how identical epigenetically they are or aren't.
Our genes are just part of the story. Something has to regulate these genes. And part of the explanation is epigenetics.
Estella wanted to see if the twins' epigenomes might account for their differences. To find out, he and his team collected cells from 40 pairs of identical twins, aged 3 to 74. Then began the laborious process of dissolving the cells until all that was left were wispy strands of DNA, the master molecule that contains our genes. Next, researchers amplified fragments of the DNA until the genes themselves became detectable. Those that had been turned off epigenetically appear as dark pink bands on the gel. Now, the genes from a pair of twins are cut out and overlapped. The results are far from subtle, especially when you compare the epigenomes of two sets of twins that differ in age. Here on the left is the overlapped DNA of 6-year-old Javier and Carlos. The yellow indicates where their gene expression is identical. On the right is the DNA of 66-year-old Ana Marie and Clotilde. In contrast to the younger twins, hardly any yellow shines through. Their epigenomes have changed dramatically. The study suggests that as twins age, epigenetic differences accumulate, especially when their lifestyles differ.
One of the main findings of research is that epigenomes can change in function of what we eat, of what we smoke, of what we drink. And this is one of the key differences between epigenetics and genetics.
Okay, so epigenetics, again, is all about those little chemical switches that turn the genes on and off without changing the DNA code. And as we mentioned, there's a variety of experiences that may influence these switches. And some of these epigenetic changes can be passed to the next generation that was previously not thought to be true. You know, again, that you got a clean slate when you were conceived, but that's not true. So researchers have been studying all kinds of issues related to epigenetics, and some of them are with the hope for treatments. So in the example that you saw related to cancer, there's been epigenetic studies of cancer because it is easier to change the epigenome than the genome. So it's easier to turn the switches on or off than it is to actually change the DNA itself. So there's a lot of hope in terms of the treatments that might be developed based on epigenetics. Okay, so in the next video, we will talk about evolutionary psychology. Thank you.